Recently, we had an election to decide the Mayor of London, and the Conservatives, who lost, now want to change the rules. They have form on this. They're kind of like the Republicans in America. They see themselves as the righteous ruling class and view democracy largely just as a framework by which to install themselves in government. And they're more than happy to introduce spurious voter requirements to try to disenfranchise their opponents. If all of that sounds impossibly brazen to you, then first of all, bless you. But second of all, let me show you an example from the last time we discussed changing our voting system in this country, and you can decide if I'm being fair. Picture the scene. The Prime Minister is David Cameron. He's less the kind of person you want running your country than he is the kind of person you want coming to your casino. His premiership was characterised by a series of referendums. Basically every time there was a policy that was fairly popular but not all that popular, and he didn't like, he just held a national vote assuming that the policy would lose and then it would go away. And like all gamblers' systems, it worked perfectly until it didn't, at which point he immediately resigned while singing a stupid song. Right. The first of these referendums was on changing the vote system from first past the post to the alternative vote. Under first past, you know what, I'm actually just going to call it plurality. Everything in electoral maths has a ridiculous name, and plurality is a more accepted name for it outside this country, and it's also, it's not clearer, but it's less actively misleading, so plurality it is. Under plurality, each voter picks their favourite candidate, and the one with most votes wins. It has the brilliant advantage of being extremely simple and easy to understand, and it has the disadvantage of everything else about it. Let me give you an example. The main disadvantage of plurality voting is vote splitting. Imagine somebody ran for election on a deeply unpopular platform like, we're going to install Windows Vista on all computers, and then 100 other people stood against them on a platform of not doing that. Suppose that 90% of the public were opposed to this policy. Well, each of the 100 candidates that were opposed to it as well would get 1/100th of 90%. They'd get less than 1% of the total vote, whereas the 10% of people who wanted Windows Vista would get their way because their one candidate would get 10% of the vote and win the election in a landslide. A policy which 90% of the population deeply oppose has won the election. The technical term for this is that plurality voting is not independent of clans. Like I say, everything in electoral maths has a ridiculous name. Moreover, the candidate who was elected is the candidate who 90% of the voters think is the absolute worst candidate. They would rather anybody else win. The technical term for this is he is the Condorcet loser, named for the Marquis de Condorcet because, again, everything has a ridiculous name. To be fair, the Marquis de Condorcet seems to have been pretty solid. He was campaigning for women's suffrage and abolishing slavery before it was cool, and he was applying mathematical rigour to what we still consider the soft sciences. The alternative vote is, an alternative to that. Under AV, each voter ranks the candidates in order of preference, and then we use those preferences to simulate several rounds of voting. In each round, it's assumed that each voter will vote for their favourite remaining candidate, and the candidate with the fewest votes gets eliminated. Once only one candidate is left, they're the winner. And the idea is that this can't possibly elect the Condorcet loser because they would lose in the last round to any other candidate. Obviously, this is a little bit more complex than plurality, and David Cameron was terribly concerned that the voters weren't going to understand it. But it's actually the same system we used to pick the winner of the X Factor, so I think people would have figured it out. But perhaps the reason that Cameron didn't think we'd understand AV is because he didn't understand AV. He said, and I quote, "If you vote for a mainstream candidate who is top of the ballot in the first round, your other preferences will never be counted. But if you vote for a fringe party who gets knocked out, your other preferences will be counted. In other words, you get another bite of the cherry." David Cameron believes that having your preferred candidate knocked out of an election is a good thing. He believes that you should have to choose between voting for your favourite candidate and having a say in the eventual two-horse race that our terrible political system will inevitably bring. He believes but if your favourite singer is knocked out of the X Factor in round 1, then voting for your second favourite in round 2 is tantamount to electoral fraud. Or, he's a huckster who believes none of these things but will say them anyway, if it means you'll vote for an electoral system that will benefit him. Which is it? I can't see inside his head, I can't possibly know. But I do know he has a degree from Oxford University in philosophy, politics and economics, and was the Prime Minister. So I think he is qualified to figure this out if he puts his mind to it. If he's truly that ignorant, I think he's so by choice, and at that point he's still a huckster, but he's also his own mark. And that's not better. But by some distance, the weirdest thing that anyone argued about AV is that it can elect a second or third place candidate. Because by second or third place candidate, they mean somebody who would have come second or third under plurality. All they're saying is that AV is different from the thing we have now, which, yeah, it's the alternative vote. If it was the same, it wouldn't be an alternative. We wouldn't have a referendum about whether to switch from a thing to the same thing. Again, I don't know. I can't see into David Cameron's mind. I don't know whether he's lying or stupid. And I know it's joint honours, but he has like a third of a philosophy degree. He must understand that alternatives are different to the things they're alternatives to. In the weeks following the referendum, the standard joke was, yeah, but AV would have won if we'd held a referendum using AV. And that's not really true. Under any two-party system, the results of any electoral system are the same. The one with the most votes wins. But what if we'd had more electoral systems on the referendum? Imagine a referendum between 5 voting systems: Plurality, AV, the runoff voting we use in the London mayoral elections, approval voting, where you get to put a cross against as many candidates as you like, but there's no preferences here, just a cross or not, and range voting, where you get to mark each candidate out of 10, and the one with the highest total score wins. Now imagine the following electorate. 40% of the population are Reds. They don't really care for democracy, but if they have to vote, they want to put a cross in a box. They'll settle for putting multiple crosses in multiple boxes. They absolutely will not put numbers in boxes. The next biggest group are the Yellows. They're at 21%. They also don't really care, but they want runoff voting. They'll settle for AV because it's kind of similar. They'll just about settle for approval voting. Range voting and first past the post are not their bag. The next biggest group are the Greens. Again, they don't really care what's going on, but their favourite is the alternative vote. They'll settle for runoff voting. At a push, they'd be happy with approval, but range voting and first past the post they don't like at all. The remaining 19% of the population are the Blues, and the Blues believe exactly the same thing as the Greens, except they bloody love range voting, absolutely can't get enough of it. They really strongly care that range voting should win the referendum. So you run the referendum and the Reds vote for plurality, and the Yellows vote for runoff voting, and the Greens vote for AV, and the Blues vote for range voting, and the Reds win because there's more of them, so plurality is the best, right? Well, not necessarily, because having the most votes is only how you win under plurality. If we assume the Reds are right, then the Reds are right. What if we held that referendum under runoff voting? In runoff voting, the 2 candidates with the highest numbers of votes go through to the next round, and then the preferences between those 2 are counted to figure out who should win. So in this case, plurality gets through because 40%, the Reds, voted for it, and runoff voting gets through because 21%, the Yellows, voted for that. In the next round, the Greens, whose preferred option of the alternative vote has been eliminated, instead switch their vote to runoff, which means that runoff wins by 41 to 40. And since the Blues also prefer runoff voting to plurality, it's kinda hard to argue that plurality should win. After all, 60% of the population say it's not as good as runoff voting. So, runoff voting's the best, right? Well, Again, hang on. Runoff voting has only been elected by runoff voting. What if we held the election under AV? The first round of AV is exactly like the plurality election. 40% goes to plurality, 21 goes to runoff, 20 goes to AV, and 19 goes to range voting. Nobody votes for approval voting, so that's eliminated, and in the next round, the 19% voting for range voting are also eliminated. The next round is where things start to get interesting, because the Blues, who really like range voting, now don't have the option of voting for that. So they're forced to vote for their second favourite, which is the alternative vote. Meanwhile, only 21% are voting for runoff voting, so that gets eliminated, and the Yellows switch their vote to alternative vote, which wins 60-40 against plurality. And again, most people who expressed a preference said that AV was better than runoff voting, so it's hard to argue that runoff voting should beat AV. So AV's the best, right? Well, again, let's not get ahead of ourselves. AV elected AV. But there's only one option on this list that everyone said they'd be basically happy with, and that's approval voting. It wasn't anyone's favourite, but everyone said they'd be okay with it. And there's a case to be made that that makes it the best choice. Similarly, not that many people wanted range voting, but the people who did really, really wanted it. And there's a utilitarian argument that that makes it the best choice. Using range voting would create the largest total amount of happiness, albeit concentrated in a small number of voters. Although in practice, obviously, there's no reason for the Reds, Greens and Yellows to honestly report that they don't care. They're going to write down a 10 for their favourite option regardless. In fact, they're probably going to write down only 10s and 0s, and range voting will collapse into approval voting. But for the sake of the argument, each system has elected itself. So if every system elects itself, how are we meant to know which is the best? Well, for that we go to mathematics and philosophy. We've defined a lot of criteria by which we judge electoral systems. And some of them are fairly obvious, like if every single voter says candidate A is better than candidate B, then candidate A should always beat candidate B. Doesn't mean they'll win, just they should always beat candidate B. That seems fair and obvious, and actually, nearly all voting systems go with this. Another one, known as the independence to irrelevant alternatives, says that if candidate A would beat candidate B in one election, then candidate A should beat candidate B in another election. And it doesn't matter who else is on the ballot in each one. The presence of candidate C shouldn't affect the rankings between A and B. And again, that sounds obvious and fair, but neither first past the post nor the alternative vote actually manages this. In both cases, it's possible for a candidate to stand and change the result by doing so, without winning the election. In fact, as an aside, the London mayoral election I mentioned at the beginning uses a system of runoff voting where you only get to put two preferences, your first and second. The idea being that you can put a fringe candidate first and then your preferred real candidate second. And then we all know that the second round is going to be between the Labour candidate and the Conservative candidate, so you can do what you want with your pretend first preference, and really the two-party system will continue unabated, and that's fine. Except, if you have a strong showing from, for example, the Green Party, and a strong showing for a jock candidate such as Count Binface, it's possible that the Green Party will come second, and then you have in the second round the Conservatives versus the Greens, and all of the Count Binface supporters, who probably would be perfectly okay with the Greens winning, have put their second preference down for Labour, and it's not counted. And what this means is that there are 100 Green Party voters out there somewhere who, had they not bothered to turn up at the polls, the Green Party would have come in third. Labour and the Conservatives would have gone through to round 2, all of the Count Binface and Green Party second preferences would have gone to Labour, and Labour would have won. But as it is, the Green Party went through to round 2, didn't get enough second preferences, and lost, and we've got a Conservative leader. There were 100 Green Party voters who would have got a better result by not turning up. This is how mad electoral maths is. None of it works. It's a disaster, and it's mathematically proven to be a disaster by something called Arrow's impossibility theorem. I said everything in electoral maths has a ridiculous name. Arrow's impossibility theorem, which is not something out of a Robert Rankin book, but in fact states that there is exactly one ranked electoral system which satisfies the criteria: if everybody prefers candidate A to candidate B, then candidate A beats candidate B, and the independence of relevant alternatives. And that system is, you pick a voter ahead of time, and whoever they say wins, wins. One man, one vote. That's it. That's the only ranked system that fulfills both criteria. And most people would say that it's not what you'd call fair. All of which is to say there is no perfect system. Whatever we decide to do, it might be possible to game the system, or it might be that it just elects the wrong person from time to time. The point of democracy is not to be perfect. It's just to make sure that everybody has an equal shot and everybody knows the rules and that they're applied equally and fairly throughout. As long as we know the rules going into an election and they're followed correctly, it's not that important what they are. But at the same time, while there is no perfect system, some systems are still better than others, and plurality or first past the post is still a disaster. The supplementary vote is kind of also a disaster. Alternative vote is not great, but there is no perfect system. We just have to pick something that's not that bad, that can't be easily gamed. But as long as the people who get to choose what voting system we're using are the people that the current voting system elects, we're probably not going to change it.